Greetings all, Ferrari 601 here. Formula One on their official YouTube channel have released this unprecedented look from the cockpit of the Renault RS19 as Daniel Ricciardo took it out on its first ever run at Catalunya in preparation for winter testing. It is very rare that we ever get the chance to look at a Formula One car in anger, driving under its own power from the cockpit with everything being shown for us to take a look at. So we're going to take a look at some of the information we can see on this steering wheel in this video. Stay tuned. On this first shot, here is our first look inside the cockpit of the RS19. Daniel Ricciardo at the controls. I am led to believe that this camera, believe it or not, is actually located inside the helmet visor, roughly between Ricciardo's eyes. So, more or less, this is the view that you'd get if you were sitting in the cockpit ready to drive this car. Looking at the steering wheel, of course, it is a very complicated, very sophisticated steering wheel. We've been seeing this overall design in Formula One since about 2014 with the beginning of the turbo hybrid power units. The biggest difference between a steering wheel in this era versus one in days gone by is the inclusion of this big LCD screen front and center. Most of the cars have this LCD mounted on the steering wheel itself. Other teams, most specifically Williams, they have a screen on the actual dashboard in the cockpits around there, but most of the other teams have an LCD right here on the steering wheel. On this LCD can be displayed literally hundreds of different informational parameters. Right here, this appears to be the default screen that the driver sees when the car fires up for the first time. There are a few identifiable features on this screen. First off, on the screen we have pit. Obviously, this is a transponder, a location transponder, probably reading GPS data to let the driver know that he is officially within the bounds of pit lane, thereby indicating pit. Below this, looks like we have the time of day. It is just 2 minutes before noon at Barcelona as the RS19 is about to turn a wheel for the first time. And in the center, obviously this is a gear position indicator. We're in neutral, and we'll be talking about this later on with some subsequent shots that we have. Over on the right-hand side of the screen, we have some more parameters. Here, SOC. It's a little difficult to see, but the little letters up top there, SOC. That means state of charge and 33%. This undoubtedly is an indication of the level of charge of the MGU batteries, most likely the MGU-K battery pack, those big lithium-ion cells underneath the fuel tank. They're charged to 33%, which is probably a default value. It's probably the minimum required to start the car. Below that, we see again the letters SOC in the upper right, and then they are repeated here, SOC 6. This probably, again, this is speculative on my part, but this probably has something to do with either the rate of charge or discharge, with energy either entering or exiting the MGU battery pack. Again, those big lithium-ion cells underneath the fuel tank. There is probably a wide range of adjustment for this setting. Ricciardo has selected setting 6 of however many steps there might be. Finally, the last thing visible on the LCD in this shot, brake bias. You can see plus 0.0%. So in other words, the car is at its default setting. We could assume that that default setting is 50-50 in terms of front to rear bias, but not necessarily. I don't know what the default value would be, and I'm sure Renault would not tell us, but he is in the default brake bias setting here, plus 0.0. And on this next shot, we go into a different display mode for that LCD. Again, just talking about the top section of the steering wheel there. You can see gone are the indications over on this side for state of charge and things like that. Instead, it's been replaced by a large rectangular white box in the center of the display. We still have pit as indicated before. We're still in neutral as we can see, but we now have the indication pit lane across the bottom, and we have a 0 here on the right-hand side. This 0 is our speed readout in kilometers per hour, so obviously the car is still stopped, and we still have the tire blankets here across the front axle, so the car is not even on the ground at this point. But this indicates that Daniel Ricciardo has punched up the pit lane speed limiter via that button there on the upper right. So this apparently is Renault's default display for when the pit lane speed limiter is active. Again, you would want this to be very obvious, very noticeable to the driver, just in case he perhaps inadvertently hits the pit lane speed limiter as he's out on track. You'd want something that would alert him very quickly so that he could take the appropriate action. This big white rectangle across the display definitely would grab my attention. Again, you want it to be visible even in peripheral vision in case he happens to be looking somewhere else. So there it is, pit lane speed limit mode on the RS19. And this next shot, this one is very interesting. Now we see that the N has turned to a 1, so we are in first gear. Also notice the tire blankets have been removed, so the car's on the ground, tire blankets are off. We have got the chief mechanic standing out in the pit lane. We are being ushered out onto the racetrack. So what this means, we're in first gear, the engine is running, 4,074 RPM indicated. Daniel Ricciardo has got the clutch in, and we are pulling off into the pit lane. Here we can see his right hand holding the steering wheel, just having selected first gear. His left hand off screen here, over to the left, probably actuating the clutch. So we've brought the revs up a bit. We're at 4,000 RPM, and we're letting the clutch out so that we can start to pull out of the pit box. Over here we have got brake balance, once again, still plus 0.0%. State of charge now on the left-hand side, still at 33%. Rear brake pressure, this is interesting, at 0. This is probably measuring in bar, but no rear brake applied. Therefore, I would also assume no front brake applied. Interesting that they'd have a rear brake pressure readout, though. And then we have SCEN14. Not entirely sure what this is. SC might indicate safety car. It also might indicate state of charge, even though we have SOC indicating state of charge up there. EN likely indicates engine. And 14, this is probably step 14 in some sort of adjustments for the engine. This is probably a fuel mixture setting, but again, there's no way for us to know. I would assume that this would be the lowest of the available fuel mixture settings, so probably step 14 of 14, thereby going up. Probably settings 13 through 1 are more settings that they would be more apt to use in racer qualifying conditions. Again, this is the car's first ever run under its own power, probably being easy on all the components, so I would fully assume this to be 14 of 14, thereby perhaps this means safety car engine map 14. Again, just some educated guessing on my part, but about to pull out into the pit lane, and that is what the Renault is displaying. Now, this shot, probably the most interesting one of all of the pictures that I've pulled together here. Have a look. We've turned out into the pit lane. We are doing some speed now in first gear, now coming up to our pit lane speed limit of 80 kilometers an hour at Barcelona. But have a look at what the steering wheel is now displaying. Here is our tachometer. We're pulling 5,880 revs at the crankshaft. Brake balance is still at 0.0%, no plus, no minus, just at the default value. State of charge 32%, it's dropped down by a percentage point. But across the top of the steering wheel in big block letters surrounded by red bars, low Revs K Shaft. This only came up for a split second on the video, but I had to grab it because this is most likely something that Renault does not want us to see. They probably don't want us to know what this means, but what I'm fairly sure this means that the engine speed is too low here at just under 6,000 RPM. The engine speed is too low to spin up the turbocharger, meaning that the MGU the MGU-H runoff of the turbocharger cannot regenerate any electricity. It could probably use some if the state of charge were a little bit higher, but it's not going to regen any power at such a low engine RPM. The exhaust pressure going through the turbo is not quite high enough to spin it up so that they can put a load on that shaft going back to the MGU unit into the battery pack to generate more power. So low revs, K shaft. If ever we see this on the Renault out there on track in race conditions, this is probably going to be preceded by a radio call saying that we have an MGU problem, and if we see this message on the steering wheel, the next action is going to be getting on the radio to say we have to retire the car. So again, they probably don't want us to know what this is, but there it is, and take a note of it. Low Revs K Shaft. This would be indicative of an MGU-H issue. Now on this next shot, still in the pit lane, we have more or less come up to the pit lane speed limit. We have 77 kilometers an hour indicated. We're back to that screen that we had before pulling away out of the garage. But now we have got something interesting. We've obviously pulled up second gear, and we're doing 77 clicks down toward pit out in this area. But look at what we've got across the bottom of the screen. No sync, followed by the numbers 1 to 8. Now, what do you think this means? No sync, and numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, what do we have 8 of in a Formula One car? Forward gears. Yep. What needs to be synchronized in order to function, in order to engage properly? Gears. Yes, this is a message about the state of the gearbox. Specifically, these transmissions, they are not synchronized transmissions. Now, in road cars, by and large, you have synchromesh. These are little geared rings which sit on a spline shaft so that when you go to engage the next gear up or the next gear down, the speed of the counter shaft and the output shaft can be synchronized so that you get a smooth engagement of the gear teeth either going up or down through the gearbox. In most racing applications, gearboxes are not synchronized because synchromesh wears very easily, and if ever you've driven a car that either does not have a synchronized gearbox or even a very worn synchronized gearbox, you have to drive it a little bit differently. You have to employ some different techniques in order to get a smooth engagement of the gears. A racing gearbox, by and large, does not have synchromesh. There are no synchronizer rings that are splined to the output shaft or the counter shaft, depending on where the gears may be in the stack. But what these transmissions do have is an automatic system that will blip the throttle and engage the clutch very briefly, all controlled hydraulically and monitored by computers so that you do get a smooth engagement, particularly on downshifts going down the gearbox through the braking zones. You will hear a bit of a bark, a blip from the engine as they are coming down through the box. That is what the computer is doing. It is cutting the clutch in very quickly, it's raising the revs on the engine, and it is now bringing the next gear in. And all of this happens literally in the space of milliseconds in these modern Formula One gearboxes. But in order to do that, the ECU, that's the engine management unit, the engine control unit, needs to know the specific ratios of each gear, but not only that, it needs to know the rev spike. It needs to know how much the revs need to come up going from one gear to the next, to the next, to the next as we're going down the gearbox. This indication of no sync means that the ECU and the gearbox have not spoken to each other yet on this run. In other words, the ECU does not know what the gear ratios are for ratios 1 through 8. Therefore, if Daniel Ricciardo accelerates up through the box and then slams the brakes and pulls this left paddle here to do some quick downshifts, we're probably going to lunge the gearbox or lock up the rear axle and spin the car, or all of the above. The ECU doesn't know how long it needs to cut the clutch in and how high it needs to raise the revs on the engine in order to get the next set of cogs engaged as Ricciardo comes down through the gearbox. So that's what this no sync warning is across the bottom of the steering wheel. It's letting the driver know, hey, I'm not sure I can do a downshift for you if you need it, so just bear that in mind and be ready to cut the clutch in manually if you have to. Now we've exited the pit lane. Daniel Ricciardo has turned off the pit lane speed limiter via this button here, and now we're out on track. We're still in second gear. We are accelerating. I don't readily see any sort of speedometer, any sort of speed readout here, but we do have some more parameters here. We still have that no sync warning. Over here on the left-hand side of the steering wheel, this is now the state of charge of the MGU system. So here we saw it was around 33, 32%. Now we have this white bar which extends up to this point, and it looks like the full extent of this display is up here. So that looks to be about a third of that bar filled, indicating that state of charge of around 32, 33%. Up here, this is our brake bias. We're still plus 0.0%, so Ricardo's not made any brake bias adjustments. And down here, it looks like we have temperatures, and they would be displayed in degrees centigrade. I'm not sure what these temperatures are, but we're 73, 73, and we're 76, and either 76 or 78. It's a little hard to see from the lighting here in this shot. Looks to be 76 once again. So two 76s and then two 73s. These could be tire temperatures, although it's not 100% conclusive on that. Values like these could also well be engine oil and water temperature. But again, it's a little bit difficult to see. If I had to guess, because there are four of them and they're located where they would correspond to left front tire, right front tire, and then off camera behind us, left rear tire and left front tire. Very interesting to see all of this. And again, our no sync warning is still here for gears 1 through 8 because we are still in second gear. And now on this next shot, very interesting to note, we have accelerated significantly. We are now into fifth gear, still coming down start finish. This is the pit exit line running here. We cannot cross that white line, but notice what has changed. Brake bias is now minus 1% from whatever the default value is. These temperature readouts, again, most likely the tires. Again, our left front, left rear, right rear, and again, those values would make sense to be tire temperatures, again in degrees C, but look at what has changed. No sync. We had 1 through 8 indicated here, but now look, we've got this empty space. We now have no sync on 1, and then 5, 6, 7, 8. We're in fifth gear now, but apparently the gearbox has now communicated with the engine management for gears 2, 3, and 4. So now we have synchronization for the downshifts for gears 4, 3, 2, if we wanted to use those gears again. So evidently, as you go up through the gearbox for the first time, the ECU and the gearbox controller, they communicate with each other, and they show each other what the ratios are and what the revs have to be in order to get those gears engaged properly. And again, that's very critical for the downshifts in order to get a smooth engagement between those gear teeth so that you don't lock the rear axle and spin the car, or worse still, blow up the gearbox. And on this next shot now, coming out of turn 5 here at Catalunya, here's the start-finish straight in the main grandstand. So we're now coming down in the opposite direction towards back to where we came from. But now we can see this no sync warning has changed again. We have no sync still on gear 1, as well as gear 7 and 8. But now the gearbox is synchronized for gears 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, as Daniel Ricciardo has been up into 6th gear during this run. Obviously, we're still in 5th gear. No speed indicated here, but tire temperatures, have a look. Now we can confirm our suspicions. Here we are. Front left tire temp, rear left tire temp, and then obviously front right tire temp, and then rear right tire temp, and there it is in degrees C. Very, very cool to see. Also, we can tell here, brake balance, we are still plus 0.0, so we're at default, and then invalid delta. So we have a lap time delta up here as well. Obviously, the car has not tripped the timing transponders across start finish, so we don't have a reference. So we have just the blank lines here. Obviously, it would be whole number, decimal back here, and then 10th, 100th behind the decimal. But very cool to see that. Very, very interesting. Again, we don't get looks at Formula One steering wheels in operation like this, but this is an unheard of opportunity. Also, we can use this opportunity to take a look at what we have on the steering wheel in terms of functions and things like that. Again, we can't figure out what all of them do, but we can make some educated guesses. Across the top of the steering wheel, we mentioned this before, this is your pit lane speed limit button. It's just a one-hit wonder. You press it once for the limiter, you press it again to turn the limiter off. Down here this is the radio button. It works in conjunction with a red light over here just to let the driver know that the radio is on. Okay, this is an acknowledgement. So this is either to acknowledge an error that would be flashed up across the display there, or perhaps it is just to talk back to the pits if Ricardo doesn't want to physically say acknowledged or copy or whatever, leave me alone, I know what I'm doing, across the radio again, he could say okay, and then the team would know that he has gotten the message. Down here, can't see what this button is labeled as, but it appears to be red or orange, very similar in color to the radio button. Below this is BO. Not entirely sure what this would be. It could be BO as in burnout. It could be a launch map. But again, don't really know. And then this blue button here. Unknown what this is. Could be a drinks button. It could be really any number of things. Over here on the left-hand side, we have N. This drops the gearbox into neutral. Probably for when you're in forward gears 2 or 1, you can press this and then you go into neutral. I would assume there's a lockout on that, so you can't inadvertently select neutral if you're running at speed, so probably third gear and above, that locks out. Over here, OV. Again, not entirely sure what this is. It could be overtake. It might go into an overtake map there just to raise the revs on the engine or go into full deploy mode on the MGU system. But again, I don't know. I don't know if this green light works in conjunction with the OV button as well. Again, just speculation. Down here, a blue button. We don't know what it is. Plus 10, minus 1. This is for navigating through all of the different submenus that could be displayed on this center LCD. This is also used in conjunction with this multifunction rotary switch in the center. Obviously, you can see just how many different subsettings can be selected across the diameter of this circle. So many different menus can be brought up just with this one rotary encoder, and you would navigate through all of that with plus 10, minus 1 over here. So again, plus 10 is probably a press and hold, and then minus 1 is just a single hit, so you can select individual items in that menu. RCH sounds a lot like recharge to me. Perhaps you would use that behind the safety car or coming into pit lane if you want to regenerate the state of charge here on this side of the steering wheel. Very cool to see all of that. And below, nothing is labeled, but this white button or yellow button, it's in direct sunlight, it's hard to tell. No idea what it is. These other rotary switches here, SCC, not entirely sure what that could be, but it's there. PU, this is obviously settings or subsettings for the power unit. Back here, don't know what that is. Could be in conjunction with this HS hybrid system. It could be a regenerate for the hybrid system, or it could be a differential adjustment. I just don't know. Brake, this could be map settings for the brake bias. Remember, these cars are brake by wire. They could have different brake maps in terms of how much regen they do off of the rear axle or things like that. Again, we're not privy to that information. More rotary encoders. We've got one here. I can't tell what it is, but it's on setting 1 right now. This one here, entry, this is undoubtedly differential adjustments, setting the preload on the differential for initial turn-in. Over on this side, we have also got another rotary switch. This is scenario, labeled as interesting. We're obviously in scenario 4 right now. This could be simply setting the pages to display on the LCD. It could be an engine map. Again, we're not privy to that, but clearly it's labeled scenario. Very interesting stuff to note here. Again, we just don't see these kinds of things very often, so when we do, we have a field day. And on this next shot, we've returned to the pit lane. We are stopped. We're sitting here in neutral. We can see the mechanics all around us there, just preparing to put us up on the jacks and wheel us back into the garage. Looking at the steering wheel now as it is, Daniel Ricciardo, he's pulled his hands away so we can see everything once again on the steering wheel. Everything that we have talked about for the most part. A couple more rotary encoders come into view. Mid. So this is obviously another differential adjustment. So remember, we had entry up here, and here we have mid. So obviously this is differential adjustment for turn in. So in, and then mid for middle of the corner. Very interesting to see all of that stuff going on there. Over here, another rotary encoder, torque. This could be another MGU regen setting, or it could be an engine map setting, or it could be a combination of the two. Again, we're not privy to that, but clearly this is labeled torque, and once again, this is our scenario multifunction rotary switch running through here. Everything else we have taken a look at before. Again, here's our HS rotary encoder and our brake rotary encoder, probably for the brake-by-wire system. These other buttons here that were not quite self-evident in terms of what they were before, they're still not quite self-evident. They appear to be unlabeled for the moment, but this one here, now we can see what this is. This is +1. This would be used in conjunction over here on the left-hand side, +10, -1, and then +1. So by pressing these two buttons, Daniel Ricciardo can cycle through the menus there across the LCD to go through into different sub-menus and to fail sensors if he needs to, turn things on and off. And again, he would get instruction from the pit wall in terms of when to do things like that, because it's quite doubtful that he'd be able to remember every single sensor in every single sub-menu and remember exactly what the functions of all of those things are. So he has some help from the pit wall in order to do things like that, but that is how he would do it with the +10, -1, and the +1, probably in conjunction with the OK button as well. So again, very cool to see things like that. And now on this shot, we're looking down and to our left in the cockpit along the side here. Have a look at this. This is the big triangle with the lightning bolt through it. This is your ignition switch. So the ignition switch roughly in this location. Over here, this is probably the fire bottle. So this would discharge the fire extinguisher either into the cockpit or underneath the engine cover if the car were to catch fire. And again, the ignition switch is here. Daniel Ricciardo reaching down to turn the car off. And on this next shot, now we have the steering wheel displaying engine kill across the LCD, and it looks like the rest of the display has been turned off, so we just have engine kill displayed there. Danny Rick has flipped the ignition switch down there, and obviously the engine is now going through its shutdown. Really, the computers are going through their shutdown protocol. The engine just needs to have the fuel cut, and then it will shut off without any sorts of dramas, or at very least, you hope so. And now on this final shot, you can see we're up on the jacks. We have got the mechanics with the blowers going into the radiator inlets as well as the brake ducts here. They're cooling the car down, and we're being pushed back into the garage. The last thing being displayed now on our steering wheel, track map, as you can see. In years gone by, and still sometimes you see it, they used to put a paper track map either someplace on the steering wheel or along the sides of the cockpit surround here across the bulkhead. This obviously is Catalunya. We're in Barcelona. It's even labeled as such. And you can see we have corner names or corner numbers here. 2, 3. Here's sector 1, turn 4, turn 5. We saw the picture from before coming out of turn 5. This is not here so that the driver can find his way around the racetrack, as it might be. What this is really for is so that the driver and the engineer are speaking the same language. In other words, if the driver has oversteer or understeer coming through turn 2, for example, this is so the driver can say turn 2, and the engineer who's also looking at this same map can look up turn 2 and realize, oh, okay, it's this left-hander going uphill. This is just basically to avoid any miscommunications that happen. In other words, yellow in Sector 1. Daniel Ricciardo will know that Sector 1 extends from start-finish through Turn 3 in the approach to the braking zone to Turn 4. There is S1. Similarly, Sector 2 from the braking zone for Turn 4 all the way up through Turn 8, 9, and then there is Sector 2. Ending right there, S2, and the timing line. Obviously, Sector 3 would then go on from Sector 2 through turns 10, through 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and then down to start-finish there, just sitting in some glare. But again, this is just so that there are no miscommunications between the driver and the pit wall. If they say there's a hazard in turn 7, there's turn 7. The driver knows exactly what we're talking about. Also, notice here we have N and an arrow. That is the direction of cardinal north. So in other words, the probably the direction of true north, not magnetic north. This is just so that the engineer and the driver can talk about wind direction. If the wind is coming out of the north, for example, that would translate to a crosswind down, start, finish. So again, you can use a map like this just so that everybody is synced up in terms of the nomenclature that they're using, as well as even some meteorological information such as wind direction, knowing which direction north is. So again, it's an extremely rare opportunity that we ever get to see inside the cockpit of a Formula One car, particularly a brand new one, before winter testing even starts, out on track, running under its own power. Nothing is being covered up, nothing is being censored. Here it is right in front of us. And again, there's a lot of information here, some of which is known, some of which is unknown, but can be pretty easily reconstructed based off of prior knowledge, and some other of this information is just speculation. But there it is, and this is what I've been able to make of it, and hopefully all of this was very interesting for all of you. It's been supremely interesting for me to delve into all of this, so hopefully you enjoyed this. Until next time, Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much for watching, and of course we will see you soon.